I think we're on. Oh, yeah. Welcome
Yeah.
to us. I'm James Ridden Waters, your regular host, and tonight I'm joined by Sebastian. Hello, Sebastian. And I've invited him on because we were both discussing these projects that we're both working on, and I've decided to title this podcast how to start and finish writing a book, basically, which is roughly the sort of things we're going to be talking about. Because I've written 180 book pages of a philosophy book, and I don't often run into many writers who are writing books, but Seb here is forgive me for telling your own story, but Seb is writing a fantasy novel. It's like 3 short stories. I read the first story and I thought it was wicked. I thought it was really good. So we thought to do a podcast and sort of discuss tips, frequent mistakes, general things about writing, and the creative process, writer's block, obviously, and how to finish, basically. So, can you open up with some pieces of advice that you well, like just your own journey, really, and then how you ended up with what was about 100 book pages worth of stuff, and really condensed, like
Uh,
writings.
yeah, I mean, I've known that I want to be a writer since I was a little kid. Like, I knew I wanted to make worlds, basically. Like, I was very into cartoons and stuff as a little kid. And I didn't know that being a writer would be the thing. At first, I thought drawing pictures would get me there. But then I realized, probably around the time I was a teenager, that like writing was where it's at. And that's the best way to, make these worlds come to life. Always been into sci-fi and fantasy above all else.
Yeah, right.
And just I could never, like, real life dramas and things could never really keep my attention as much as fantastical worlds and stuff like that. And so I was always into that, and as I went on, I noticed that like a lot of my favorite worlds to visit were not written very well, just because I think the temptation with sci-fi and fantasy is to lean really heavily into tropes.
Yeah.
And like, if you're writing a sci-fi, then you spend all your time talking about this intergalactic federation and the kinds of star cruisers they have and blah blah blah, and they tend to not devote as much time to character development and the smaller nuances of the plot that a lot of literature would take the time to do. So when I found those rare authors that do both, I get really excited.
Yeah, right.
Like, off the top of my head, I'm thinking of like Clark Ashton Smith or like Kurt Vonnegut. And there's a British author, and I'm going to butcher his name because I've never actually heard it pronounced, but it's China Mieville or something.
Okay.
Anyway, he wrote this book, Perdido Street Station, that's extremely imaginative, but also extremely well written. And I loved that. And yeah, so just that, basically, like, I've focused primarily on music for the last decade, but I've always been reading and I've always been taking notes, and I've been building like multiple worlds kind of in these notebooks, and with like comprehensive notes and stuff, and just on cultures and geography and whatever else in that world. And with the idea of turning them into stories at some point, and I finally just decided, I'd kind of tiptoed around it and started a short story that was going to take place in one of these worlds a few years ago. And now with the quarantine, I just figured, why not? Let's just finish it. And so I got really disciplined about it and just did it. And like within about 2 months, I had my first short story, and it's basically a quarter of the book. It's a lot longer than a short story. So it's about a quarter of a book. So I'm planning on writing about 4. It's about 1 act in the book. So I'm planning on writing about 4 acts and then having a full book. And yeah, it was a really fun experience. And I'm overall, I guess you would call me like a novice writer when it comes to the actual writing part. But as far as being passionate about writing and taking detailed notes and creating these worlds, I've been doing that for years and years.
Yeah, right. I've written some like some sort of tips on what sort of problems people might run into. So for example, you I mean, I want to just sort of talk about you said before we began recording that you haven't had writer's block in a few years, right? You haven't had that sort of problem that a lot of people have faced with in a while. And I want to sort of ask you sort of like what techniques you got picked up to sort of prevent that from happening.
Yeah, so I think that like with all art that I've done, because I also do music, I do some drawing pretty casually, and I just have found in all pursuits that like the best way to approach art is like a combination of discipline and like I guess what you'd call like the muse, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
because
yeah,
you're gonna have days when you're more inspired than others, but there are ways to kind of stoke that inspiration and keep it going. And oftentimes that's just through treating it like a job and just
yeah,
showing up, doing some work every day
yeah, 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 yeah.
and accepting that not every day is going to be that stroke of brilliance. But the ways that you get that stroke of brilliance more, I think, is that you get really into, at least for me, I got really into journaling like way back when I was like probably 15. And I found that like at first I was more into just the idea of having a journal,
Yeah,
I
right, right,
some
right.
it
I think that's a pretty common thing. You like that kind of idea, like, oh, I'm going to keep a journal, but you don't actually like implement any like genuine material. It's just like, oh,
exactly.
I went to the shop and I got some eggs
You
or
see that you see the
whatever.
moleskin display at the shop and you're like, okay, I gotta have one of those. That's gonna
Yeah.
make me a real artist. And then and you
Exactly.
fall in love with the aesthetic of it. But that was the shocking thing is that I didn't know what to fill those pages with. But then I realized that just having it around and the more I thought about it and the more I just made myself write stuff in it, then the ideas started to come faster than I could even control them.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah,
like my brain, once my brain was trained to that, to like, and because it wasn't even a ritual thing like sitting down for hours and writing at the journal. It was just having it on hand, and then when something in life inspires me, or a book that I'm reading, or anything else, or a song that I hear inspires me, I'll just write it down. And at first, it was very self-conscious thing. Like I was aware that I was doing it, and like, okay, how do I turn this into a note, and blah blah. But now, I mean, I can have dozens of those, or not dozens. I would say on average, I probably have maybe like anywhere from like 2 to 10 of those bullet points a day.
Right, 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 right. That's really
Where,
good. I mean, that's fantastic, right?
but that's what I'm saying is that it's like that's a perfect illustration, I think, of what I'm talking about how just doing it
yeah, yeah,
kind
yeah,
of
yeah.
gets you into that place where the muse starts striking more often.
Yeah.
And also I think, yeah, so I think it's that combination of like, yeah, you have the discipline, you just show up to do it, but then you also give yourself the freedom to let your mind wander. Because I think that is the thing. As artists, we tend to be unstructured a little bit, right? Like
Yeah,
that's
right, of course.
the tendency. And I think that when you allow yourself these periods to think, and I think solitude is a part of that too. So like going on a walk, even if you live with
Yeah,
other
yeah,
people.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
I've actually learned about this. It's called the incubation stage of the brain. So whenever you're like, the thing of shower thoughts
yeah,
and like having a walk, what happens is I can't say this is a reliable source, but when you are in the shower or taking a walk, your brain gets put into a state where like it's much more relaxed and much more open to ideas, and that's when you come up with that's very much a time when you come up with all these sorts of ideas. But like what you're saying about, if I can interrupt, what you say about like training your brain to do it and actually doing it, I have a little bit in the epilogue which called hack, about hacking your brain almost, and like how your brain, if you are focused on one important goal, then you can like, if it is like in some sense, it's an artist's purpose, or at least one of his purposes, but very primary purpose, to make art. I don't think creativity is like a hobby. For those people, I don't think it's like a hobby or anything, like something that you do on the side. I think it's like a very fundamental part of who you are. And
yeah, exactly.
I and I think if that is the case, then of course you should really like manifest the abilities of your brain to just write, and that could come from like, every time you get an idea, you write it down and you explore the idea, and you just take it to its utmost end just to mess around with it, and then you by doing it, you recognize how you're doing it wrong, and by constantly doing, you're going to constantly get things wrong, but that's a brilliant part of it, because you want to go wrong, so you can then be like, oh, I've made that mistake and now I don't have to do it, because everyone's making mistakes, right? So yeah, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And then also to that duality that I was speaking on, I think that there's actually a certain comfort in being organized. Like, because again,
Yeah,
I don't think, I mean, most artists I've known, including myself, tend toward disorganization in
yeah,
their lives. And I found that by forcing myself to get just a little bit organized, or in ways that help me, like I use Evernote, for example. So I have notebooks in Evernote that are like for each project that I'm working on. So I've got one Evernote for this story, one notebook for this story, one notebook for the next musical album I'm working on. And
yeah,
like when you have that and you have just even a little bit of organization, I can just quickly, when I have these ideas, I just throw them in one of those
yeah, yeah,
notebooks
yeah, yeah.
because I know that it'll be there later for me when I need it, when I actually do have the writer's block. And so I've got this bank of ideas. And so that's like, because there's plenty, I'd say most days out of the week, I'm not firing on all cylinders, having this mega inspiration day. But then you've got these ideas banked and you've got them where you know you can find them. And then you can lean a little more on that on those off days, you know?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I mean, I actually do the exact same thing as you. I have this app called Mindly, which is like a mind map app. So you have like a
Yeah.
dot, and then you click on it, and then you go into these other things and whatnot. And I'm not at that stage anymore because I've written I'm nearly complete, so I'm nearly finished with the book. I mean,
Right.
you finished with the short story, but I've finished with the book, which means that I'm just where I'm more in the process of editing and refining as opposed to just creating. But when I was creating, I had loads of ideas, and most of them were shit. Like most of them were rubbish, and
Right.
that was great because it's not all of them, right? So like you have those small ideas that are like, well, what if that's true? And then you try and break it down either through fiction or non-fiction. You try and dismantle it and get rid of the notion, oh, that's not a good. How is this maybe not a good idea? Maybe 3 months later, and some of those ideas are still solid and still like this is something I've discovered that I could be onto something, and
Yeah.
um, and those ideas sort of end up taking over from my experience. Those ideas are the ones with their entire chapters or main pieces. For example, I mean, yeah, like for example, like there are some ideas from when I started your book that I didn't know they were going to keep going. Like, do you mind if I tell you? I mean, it's just the beginning of
Go
the book.
ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Thank
yeah,
you.
yeah. So no, man, it's like so you got this. So you have this main guy, Hattie, and then he has this what you're not sure whether it's a person or not a person, but they're made of straw and their name's Jeb, and I had no idea how important Jeb would be for the entire book, but Jeb sort of becomes like Hattie's very center part of Hattie, the main character, and so the entire book. And like that's a very interesting thing to see, like something that could have been a very small idea become like almost the centerpiece of the whole book, which has happened with me as well. So it's an interesting parallel, I have to say.
Well, I think, yeah, like what you're talking about, it's like when you understand, and you've been doing this kind of stuff long enough and you understand that a lot of the ideas aren't going to make it to the final thing, but you still give yourself permission to kind of sit with them for a while, like you were saying.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
Because, yeah, you don't know what's going to end up becoming a lot bigger than you anticipated. You don't know what's going to end up becoming a lot less important than you anticipated.
yeah,
And so I think just, yeah, giving yourself permission to sit with and consider these ideas for a minute and then just get rid of the ones you don't need. And it's nothing personal. And it's just like part of the whole refinement of it.
yeah, right. I agree. What else have I
Yeah.
got? What else have I got here? Um, that's something. Yeah, that one's more something for like my book. I mean, yeah. So like I.
Bad.
No worries, no worries. I mean, I say I also say that you're going to sacrifice. You have to sacrifice certain parts of your. I mean, certain parts of like normality, I suppose, to actually dedicate yourself to a project. But that's fine, because I think for a lot of artists, maybe writers in particular, they there's a sort. This could just be me, but I sort of see like a kind of crossroads where you sort of you just sort of stick to your normal routine because getting so immersed in it might be a scary idea, and then just sort of biting the bullet and going for it and sacrificing like your normal senses of the world because writing a book can like seriously change you, I think. and how you perceive things. I mean, when I'm writing this, I certainly see the world in terms of what the book is, and I have a lot of I'm sort of analyzing sort of my book, the sort of the state of language and reality, and kind of being like, oh right, this is an experience that I can actually add to the book. But like being open, sacrificing what isn't needed from your life, I think is very important, and being open.
Absolutely.
I mean,
So I think there's multiple ways to do that. Like, so when you were doing yours, did you do these like deep dives where you would just write all day or stay up really late at night?
For sure, yeah. Hours, and then sometimes.
Okay, see, because I didn't do it that way, and I feel like my way might be the weird way to do it because
maybe
I broke
your way
mine
probably
up.
sounds better than mine, to be honest. But yeah, go on.
No, but I think both make sense. I think both definitely have things to merit them. It's like I had to do it kind of in an unconventional way because if I don't get 8 hours of sleep every night, like my health issues flare up.
Yeah.
So like sleep is like my number one defense against that. So like that was a big factor for me, is like I couldn't pull these all-nighters and stuff. So I had to figure out a way to do it like that, and I just split it up, and for a while I was just doing an hour a day, and that I was surprised at how fast that added up actually. But I'm not saying that's the right way. I'm just saying it's a way to do it, and it's a less conventional way, but I think that like either way, whatever you find works best for you.
Well, exactly. You can talk about how you do it your way, and I can talk about how I do it my way. I mean, I do.
The commonality. I think the common idea that you brought up between the two is that you have to sacrifice a little bit of normality for that. Like, like these kind of projects require, like, contrary to popular belief, they require a very proactive shaping of your habits. Because how many people do we know that talk about being writers but haven't done anything? It's like, because in order to get that done, you do have to make sacrifices. Where usually the social life is the first thing to go, and
which is lucky because it's locked down at the moment, exactly. so it's a good time to like be creative.
Yeah, but I think that like everything in my life, I mean, the way that I cook, the way that I dress, everything is kind of I've formulated to some degree towards like minimalism, so that I don't have to waste as much time on other things.
Yeah.
And I can spend as much time as I need writing, because I think that when you have these, the larger you can carve out these blocks of time to kind of work or let your mind wander, or whatever stage you're at, I think the better.
Yeah.
Because who wants to be, I don't know, I've just found that the worst thing as an artist is getting interrupted all the time.
Yeah.
I think it's just like the only thing I really ever need is just a large chunk of time. Just give me a 5-hour block.
Yeah,
and I'll get something done.
I mean, I think also being like open to sort of constantly, it's this weird sort of, I always see it as a sort of weird state where you're not rethinking, but you're just like letting ideas come, and it's not like a forceful thing. It's like a kind of just like you just sort of let, it's almost like a some kind of similar to the incubation stage, but like kind of something that you sort of affirm for, I suppose, where you end up just being like, right, what can I possibly receive that will help this kind of thing. You might see an exchange on the street, and you might interpret it a certain way or you might have a conversation with someone and think, I'm not saying that like you can find inspiration in all of these things, but like I don't know, I was surprised where I saw inspiration. It's just like it might just be this one thing, like where I sort of there's one example I can actually give where I was just like messing around with the concepts in my head just to like see which way they fit, and it was this like it was like this. For me, with my book, it was this notion of the will to conceptualize, which is this will to make sense of the world through concepts. But there was also this other concept that didn't seem to fit with that concept, which was the will of language, which is more the kind of the representation having its own behavior and effect on how you see the world that isn't in your control. And I was like, but these are two different things. And I was sort of messing around with the concepts a little bit. And I realized that they were two parts. I mean, at least I could be wrong. I could think about it differently later, but they were definitely two parts of the same coin. That like they're both, and it's one goes out and one goes in. But the important part of that was it was just like a state of just like sitting there and just letting it happen on its own almost. I wasn't, even when even when I think about what I should say, even right now, I could be thinking about, oh, what should I say next, and I go speechless and I can't say anything. And I think a similar thing's happening when you write. And when you almost when you're doing anything, and to be honest, if you have to stop and be like, what am I doing, as you're like pouring it, it's like walking down the stairs is a good example. You end up tripping yourself up, but it might be the case that people who are on creative missions end up sort of being like, oh, I've got, sort of stressing all this energy into like the front of their brain and saying like, I need to make something, when you don't do that when you do anything else, right? You just you just let it happen, but you have to be open to letting it. You have to be open to a specific thing, but you can't force it, is my point.
Absolutely. I think that like, yeah, and that's one of those things too that always frustrated me when I was younger, because it's one of those things, I think they kind of made fun of it in that movie Forgetting Sarah Marshall, if you've seen that.
I haven't, no.
Well, back in the day I watched it, and it's like Paul Rudd has a little minor appearance in that movie, and he's a surf instructor in Hawaii.
Yeah.
And he's trying to teach him how to get up. They're on the beach and he's trying to teach him how to get up on a surfboard. He's like, you don't do anything. And he's like, okay. And so he just lays there on the surfboard. He's like, no, you got to just pop up. You just got to do it. He's like, but you said not to do anything. He's like, no, man, doing too much. But I think that was just kind of making fun of it. But I think it's one of those concepts that, like, yeah, once you've done it, it makes a little more sense. But like, I think you said it well. It's just being too forceful about these kind of things. Yeah, I don't think I'd put out my best work when I'm trying to force it either. I think that like when you give yourself time and you give yourself permission to just kind of exist and collect data, like I don't start my day thinking about like, oh, how am I going to go get inspiration for my book? Like it is, I've been just kind of putting it in that bucket for years now, as I work on other things, and things are getting, inspiration is getting put in multiple different buckets for different projects. And then when I feel like I've got enough, then I'll go and I'll sit down and actually turn it into something. But yeah, I think that process, like your subconscious, I think knows when you're working on something, and it'll start putting the pieces together while you're not even thinking about it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, even like dreams, like sort of tell me things that I feel that I didn't realize I felt, and I'm not being too like Jungian about it and thinking that everything has a meaning, but like certainly, I'll have like certain elements of my dreams. I'm kind of like, but that's just an example of your subconscious, sort of, it's much more powerful than you think. But
I have an anecdotal thing about subconscious real quick that just proves it, like, because I haven't even done much reading about the subconscious. This is just firsthand evidence of it working. I went backwards in reverse chronological order through a lot of my voice memos, where like I usually use voice memos for songs and stuff and to sketch out song ideas. And so I listened to one song, and it was like in its most recent version, and I was playing it on guitar, right? I was playing some little riff on guitar or something. Then I'm making my way back through a bunch of other different songs. And then like 2 months prior to that, I hear a more rudimentary version of that song on guitar, but I'd given it a different name.
Right.
And then I go back like 4 months earlier than that, as I'm just going through other files, and I hear myself humming an even more rudimentary version of that same thing.
Wow.
And I wasn't aware of it. So I had given them different names because I thought they were new songs, new ideas each time. But just seeing that, I realized that my subconscious had been kind of working on that on some level and making it more complex.
As music, I've had a very similar thing. I'll literally like I will play a song as I remembered it, and then exactly the exact same thing, and not only do you like remember, not only does your subconscious actually end up doing things for you, but you actually forget the original version. You forget the more rudimentary version of the piece, because your brain has already said no, this is how it sounds now, almost. Same thing with the book. I'll go back and I'll be like, did I write it like that? It's not quite like that anymore. But I haven't done any like actual forceful writing to actually change that chapter, but it's just happened on its own. But again, it comes down to that kind of acute kind of like I'm open to change. I'm open to let this change and naturally grow as it is. I write that like that like a book is where is it? Yeah, like all right, let me find it.
Wooden stairs, man. Wooden stairs.
Oh fucking hell, they're
I'm
fucking
kidding.
awful. No.
I don't care.
I want to put oil on them, but they're fucking stairs. I can't do it.
I don't care. It's
Um, yeah, but like I say that the sort of the book is like it's writing it for me was a bit like a tree, it's like a sort of grows and um the growth of the growth of the roots too happens with the growth of the entire tree. So the foundations and purposes of the book may come at the same time as the conclusions and afterthoughts. So I don't know how much you agree with me on that, but like I never saw it as like I'm gonna write the first chapter and then just see where the second chapter goes. It all sort of came together and like the bits broke off and stuff in the same way that like concepts would grow and for example in my opinion like story the story arc has to come like before even the specifics of like what clothes the person's wearing, for example, and like that kind of those sorts of arcs and those sorts of narrative devices definitely you sort of have to think about those things before like specifics. Like it's you paint the background and then you paint the foreground, but the background is you see what I mean.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing that I really agree with the most is that openness that you were talking about. I think everything we've been talking about kind of centers around
yeah.
Because even like what you were just saying, like I had a little bit of a different experience. So like my current story,
I'll go on. Yeah.
it actually just started as like a little impressionist scene that I got while listening to music. Like I was listening to the Pixies' Doolittle, which is one of my favorite albums.
Mm-hmm.
And this was like probably 3 or 4 years ago. And when I first got the idea for this story, and I was listening to that song, Mr. Greaves. And like, for some reason, I was just thinking about the aesthetics of the albums and how the albums kind of sound and how they remind me of like the desert. And they remind me of this kind of eeriness and stuff. And there's kind of a violence underneath the music. And I started envisioning in my own head this weird desolate world in a desert with evil creatures, and even just the title of the song Mr. Greaves made me think of some underground boogeyman, and that's where the character of old Jack came from. And like, but it all just kind of started with like an impression, and it's almost like I started with a specific scene in mind. Because I actually saw in my head, I just saw a scene that was like brown desert, a very scrawny kind of country bumpkin character in a straw hat, and then like a boogeyman underground. And I was like, okay, how can I build a story that allows me to create that scene? And so I think it can come from a lot of directions. Like you can start widescreen, or you can start microscope. But I think either way, I think that openness to just letting the ideas come and not trying to force it through some rigid continuity or whatever. I think that really helps, and just keep collecting those ideas, and then eventually the story will call out to you, or the book itself will call out to you when it's ready. Like it's like once you've accumulated enough ideas, like you'll hit this point, I think, where it just spills out and it's ready to go. It's time, and you've collected enough. But I think rather than trying to do that linear approach of just like how do I get from chapter 1 to chapter 2, just throw a bunch of ideas at the wall. See what sticks, which one's harmonized.
I mean, that's the thing about artists, because it does the inspiration for art, of course, comes from a place of disorganization, because it's not science. Science obviously is the complete other end. It's deductive,
Right.
Whereas art, of course, comes from intuition and that those sort of finding those ideas and representing them subjectively and authentically, because authenticity, as I think about it now, actually is like, it's not really a sort of thing of science in the same way it isn't art, because art is like this, it has to represent an idea subjectively, which means it can be it can be a state where it's not represented as well as it could be, whereas science in a sense is like either true or false. Art has this kind of degree of authenticity and quality, and I had another thought there, but it just left me. So I've got to be open to find it again. Yeah, like oh yeah, that was it. I've always found that like if I have the option to change something about the book, I mean, I'm writing a philosophy book, so this may not apply to you, but if I have if I have the option to change something about the book and it seems like it could be a good idea, I normally change it because I think there's a tendency to get stuck in habits of what you think the book or whatever it is should be because you've read it that many times and you've ended up saying
Yes. Yes.
you've ended up saying this is the way it is because this is how it is, even though halfway through the book, the entire purpose of the book may completely change. It may. I'm not saying it has to, but it may completely change, and you may end up getting stuck in that kind of, oh, but that's not the way the book initially was. But I found in my experience, it's like the Monty Hall problem. If you know what the Monty Hall problem is, where you have you have the car and the two goats, and they're underneath like doors, and you have to like and what happens is you end up pointing to one of them, and then you lift like one with the goat and you say, do you change or not? And for people, it seems like a 50-50 choice as to whether they should change their initial choice or not. But in fact, it's way better if they do change because the circumstances have changed. And problems have, the goat or the bad thing has revealed itself regardless of what direction you were going in to begin with. So I think it's analogous to actually change, if you're given the option to, the premise of my book has changed completely in the last 6 years. It was just me like high off like weed, just like being like, oh, how does language change? Why don't we see the world the way we could and stuff like that and now it's
I'd imagine your life events made it a lot more personal then.
Yeah, right.
After a point.
Yeah,
I could not agree more, man. That's like a big thing. And I'm sure there's like some, elegant maxim that describes that phenomenon. But like, I'm not thinking of it right now. But what I've always just said for myself is don't be afraid to go back to the drawing board.
Yeah.
Like if you get too married to an idea, oftentimes, like I think with writer's block, at least as I've experienced it when I'm songwriting and sometimes with fiction, but I haven't done as much fiction as songwriting, is that like, yeah, I find that oftentimes when you get stuck, it's because you are being too uncompromising about your ideas. You're not letting them take a natural progression. Yeah. And I would liken it to like when I was, living in the city and I was going on more like first dates and stuff. Like I realized that there was the conversation would flow a lot better when you just let it go where it was going to go and follow the thread of the conversation versus waiting to get in your cool idea that you think is going to impress somebody. It's like,
yeah, man. I mean, exactly. And I think for me at least, that was definitely like, when I was like, I don't know, 17 or so, that definitely, like, and even later, I mean, in Finland, I was quite a nervous wreck because, I was in a new environment and I was just recovering from psychosis. But like, I definitely had this kind of like this stocky kind of, oh, how, I had a funny thing to say, but that thing's gone now, and things, and how do they think of me, and how do they think of me, and I have insecurities, but I don't have insecurities because I don't believe them. I won't believe them and stuff like that. When I'm not sure if that was what you were talking about, but like,
well, just the willingness to go with the flow, I would say,
right.
Versus getting so married to your original intent and your original idea that you ignore where it's going, So I'd say, the equivalent of trying to make a funny joke after the subject of the conversation has changed on a date is the same thing, in my opinion, as, oh, you kind of wrote yourself into a corner in your book, and instead of going back and throwing out what you wrote for the last few paragraphs, you'd rather try to make it work, and then you get stuck in writer's block. I just think that might even go back to what we were saying about note taking and inspiration. It's that same, like, I guess to use a cliche, that be like water approach, where you are willing to go with the flow and you're willing to let go of things and give things up and just see where, if it's going in a different direction, if it's evolving in a different direction that makes more sense, just being okay with that.
Yeah,
That's how
yeah.
I mean, that's, I guess, like, and I didn't even really like realize that. I hadn't put that into words before until we started talking here, but that's definitely
Yeah,
approach. I
for
mean,
sure. For sure. At some point, I want to talk about like imposter syndrome, or when you, because I get this all the time, the belief that your writing isn't good enough because your taste is far superior to your ability, I suppose.
right.
And at least for me, like, I have this kind of, I do have this kind of like, I read it so many times, and I also read other people's work, and I say, well, does this compare? Am I, and the thing is that I find that you shouldn't be comparing, and you should be, it's a cliche, but you should be comparing yourself to who you were yesterday rather than other people, because everyone writes differently. Everyone's got their own way of doing things, their own technique, how often they write, how long for, and not to understand that, like, it's a very common thing to believe that your writing isn't good enough after so long, because I'm very bipolar with it. Like, I'll have a day where I think the writing's awful, then I'll have a day where I think the writing's fantastic and revolutionary, and all the rest. And so I mean, do you have these experiences? I mean, I think it's quite a common thing to have,
Definitely.
as people have told me. But yeah, I just want to hear your
Yeah,
thoughts on that.
absolutely. This, thankfully for me, I think this was one of the earliest lessons I learned, the earliest like meta creative lessons that I learned way back when I was like probably like 14 or so. I did a quick video about this on my Instagram because I was just thinking about it, and I was like, do you know who Alan Moore is?
Yeah, for sure, of course, of course.
Yeah, so he's, for anyone listening, he's like, he wrote Watchmen, which is probably his most famous work. He wrote V for Vendetta. He wrote The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. And the latter, the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, the movie sucked, but if you read the book, it's just the way that he writes. He's very, very referential and extremely just like stuffed with nuance. Like, he notoriously will write like paragraphs of description for his artist for just like one panel on a comic. And
Yeah,
so the guy is just meticulous. Like, you can just tell he writes day and night, just obsessively. And like, I remember as a teenager reading The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and it's like, to the extent it takes place in this world where like all these works of like 1800s like fantastical literature kind of coexist. So like, you've got the world of like Sherlock Holmes and Frankenstein and all these things, and are like all these worlds, Dracula and stuff. They're all coexisting, and then you have this kind of like 1800s version of the Super Friends that forms.
right.
Um, Based on all these works of literature. And so like, you'll be like reading a page of this, and some random character will appear and have a minor interaction in the background of a panel, but that interaction is like referential to something else that happened in a work of literature and stuff. So I just remember reading that as a teenager and being like, how the hell am I ever going to create something like this? Like, this is just so beyond anything I can ever even see
Well,
myself
great. Yeah,
doing.
yeah, 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 yeah.
And I remember at the time just kind of like then comparing everything I did to Alan Moore's work, and I was just like, man, like, should I just give up, And then, which of course now it's a ridiculous thought, but like, I remember thinking at the time, like, okay, it actually might be best to just not think about his work at all. Like, when I read his work, just read it and enjoy it, but don't think about what it took to make it. And like, over time, I just took that lesson with me, and I think that like, just deliberately ignoring comparison can be a very useful tool, I think, and also feeding your own self confidence, because it's like, especially now with the internet and stuff, it's very easy to encounter a ton of negativity, whether it's for yourself or even for other artists, and you see the way that they're getting skewered by random people. And instead of remembering, oh, these are just random people who aren't actually out there writing anything themselves, it's very easy to get fooled into thinking those opinions matter. And
And they don't at all. Like,
they
not
don't
not
at
even not
all.
even a little bit. Yeah, like
Yeah, because
not
the
even a
kind of
little bit.
people who are actually creating great things, first of all, they tend to want to support other creators.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
yeah, the people spewing that kind of negativity is always coming from a personal place. Um, and yeah, so there's the negativity on one side, and then on the other side, it's just people who are just really skilled. It's not worth comparing yourself to them either. Like, and then, yeah, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised one day that like, oh, and the thing is, I still don't have an objective. I mean, as much as anything can be objective in art, right? But I still don't have like an objective idea of like where my story stands compared to other authors, but I don't really care. It's like if enough people are enjoying it, and if I enjoy it, if I read it through and I'm proud of what I did and I really, and I like, then what else matters, because I've done work in the past where I'm like, this isn't my best work. I have room to improve. But this one, I really felt like I hit a milestone and I was really proud of it and I entertained myself reading it. And so I think that that's really all that matters. If you're making the kind of work that you yourself enjoy consuming, and you can read it or listen to it multiple times and enjoy it every time, then I would say that's a win,
Yeah.
So why waste time trying to get some objective score from the cosmos? I mean, we're all going to be dead one day anyway, so.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's a good lesson for me anyway. Like, that's a great lesson. Great lesson for me because I do find myself in that situation where I will be sort of reading other philosophical works and I'll be like, this isn't quite what I'm saying, but like but everyone writes differently and everyone's got problems and insecurities, and to be criticized by someone that that isn't writing at all, let alone someone that is writing who would be more likely to support you anyway, it's great. I think it's rubbish.
Yeah, exactly. Well, because I mean, there's just too many variables. How are we going to measure it, objectively, right? I just think if enough people enjoy it, then it's great. Or if you yourself enjoy it, I guess that's probably the biggest mark. But like, obviously we all want to improve, so sometimes we're looking for criticism. I would think, if you want to improve, you're looking for some criticism or whatever. So then where to go to get some. People whose opinions that you trust, who you think have good taste, you can go to them. And like, maybe if nobody whatsoever enjoys your work, then maybe you've got some work to do, right? But like, other than that, I think it's a waste of time trying to assign some objective score to what you're doing.
Yeah. I wanna ask you like a genuine question because I don't do this. I don't build worlds. And your world that you read that in Beneath is Sebastian's book, or at least the first story, and I found the world so consistent and meticulous that it was completely believable to me, even though it features like all sorts of fantastical creatures that I know could never exist. So I want to ask, I don't know how I'm going to word this question, but I want to ask like, how did you manage to keep the story so engaging and conclusive and consistent while also keep having these meticulous sort of little bits that sort of added to the story, and like, can you guide me through like your process or like any,
Sure.
just yeah, go for it.
Well, I think that the key to world building is details, because even if you're a reader who's not into details, I'm a reader who loves details. I love hearing things like, oh, they've got this weird dish that they eat, or oh, this culture in this forest does things this way, right? Has this, spiritual belief or whatever. I love those little details because I'm just kind of a nerd for that. But even if you're not a nerd for that, I think if those things are missing, it can ruin your suspension of disbelief. It's like when you're playing a video game and instead of a really like, I just remember thinking this, like I was playing a shooter video game, right?
Yeah.
And it was a pretty good game. But I remember going through this level and there were a lot of these big empty rooms with no purpose, right? And it's like, I'm not paying attention necessarily to every little piece of rubble and stuff, but that's why I like the Gears of War games, because it's this like landscape and there's all this like old kind of European inspired architecture and it just crumbled everywhere you go.
Yeah.
And even if you're not paying attention to that kind of stuff, it just livens it up and it makes it feel real and it makes it feel like a living, breathing place. And then as soon as you discover, not in that game, but in a different one, you discover these kind of empty rooms, it just kind of ruins your suspension of disbelief. You're like, oh yeah, I'm in a video game level and the designer was too lazy or they ran out of budget to fill up this level with interesting backgrounds.
Yeah.
And so I think it's the same thing as like, even if you're not a nerd for details, if they're missing, you notice it and it stops feeling like a real world. Because it's the same thing as our own world, right? Like there's a lot of things you're not paying attention to. I lived in New York City for 4 years. There's a lot of things I'm not paying attention to when I'm just going to and from work. I'm not noticing every hot dog vendor, and I'm not noticing every tourist and what language they're speaking, and I'm not noticing all the different shop neon signs in the restaurant windows and stuff.
Yeah.
But they're there, and if some of that stuff was gone, you'd notice.
You'd notice, yeah.
And so,
yeah.
I think that it's the same concept with fantastical writing is just what I would call it, I guess, because like sci-fi fantasy, I like to blend the two. I don't see them as two distinct genres necessarily. But if I had to pick one, I'd pick fantasy because I guess I don't really care about the speculative, like sciencey sci-fi.
Yeah.
But yeah, so like I think that a good world involves a lot of detail, and you've had people that took that to an extreme, like Tolkien, who invented languages. I don't take it nearly to that level, but I want it to feel real. And I think that reality is given to you by the details. And then what you realize reading a lot of fantasy and sci-fi is that the temptation is to what writers call info dump, or,
yeah, well, this is a good topic. Yeah,
exposition or whatever, right? And it's where you just kind of stop the action dead in its tracks to kind of give the reader multiple paragraphs of explanation as to how things work. And I think that goes back to that universal artistic concept of like show, don't tell. It's just so much powerful to show people something than it is to tell them. And and it just ruins the pacing and the flow of the story. And so many sci-fi and fantasy authors do it, and the really good ones don't. And so I'm like studying the really good ones, and I want to do it like them. So like, I just kind of picture that it's a movie, and in a movie, you might get like with certain historical epics or Star Wars, for example, you might get that text at the beginning that kind of explains the setting. But other than that, like in most movies, everything is contextual. Everything has to be revealed by either conversation or by things you see. And so I think by kind of putting that restraint on myself, and that's a bigger conversation about in art in general, I think restraints can be super helpful.
Limitations, yes, for sure.
Yeah, limitations. Yeah, so by putting that limitation on myself, like make it cinematic, pretend it's a movie, I think that I let the exposition unfold in a much more natural way at its own pace.
There was this one element of the book that that I wasn't sure of something, and you took about 25. It took about, well, in book terms, it took about 40 pages before you confirmed something. I forget what it was, but it took about 40 pages before you confirmed a certain detail to me. And you could have had all the time to say, "Oh, it was this." But do you remember the part I'm talking about? Because I don't remember. It was like something to do with maybe Jeb and whether he is real or not, and then later you're always ambiguous, and then it was past halfway in the book, and you had then openly said from a character's mouth, mocking the person for believing they were real, believing they're not real. I won't try not to give it away.
Yeah.
and I thought it was such a lovely touch because it left me unsure, and you didn't just ruin it by just sort of saying, "Oh, this is the state of things," But there are so many examples in the book that I found really good for that reason. That there are certain things of like, a certain thing happens in the middle of the night. I won't give it away, and then later you find out what happened, but you didn't. I didn't even think it was going to be important until later. Right. That sort of meticulous world building. I was just like, bloody kind of, I was just very impressed by it. I was like, wow,
Thanks, man. Well, I just try to, I honestly, with everything I make creatively, I try to just do things that I've always wanted to see or things that I like seeing and I wish I could see more of. And so for me, I love those little moments where it rewards the reader's attention. And I love getting, I love mystique and mystery and stuff. And I think that sometimes there's not enough of that. And then sometimes there's too much of that. Like sometimes there's too many mysteries and too many things are left unsolved. And I personally don't like that. So I wanted to create the kind of book that I would enjoy reading. And so my solution to that was give people a lot of mystery, but slowly reveal things to them so that they feel like as an author you are giving them the breadcrumb trail.
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah,
know?
yeah, yeah.
And so that was just why how I arrived at that decision is just like, hey, what am I not seeing enough of? And to me, I wasn't seeing enough things that like hit that perfect sweet spot between just mysterious enough and not too mysterious, you know?
Yeah.
So that was just the decision making that led to that. So I'm glad it worked out.
I was gonna make a note to say like if you don't absolutely love what you're writing about, then you're not going to finish it. Like you have to love
Yeah.
it. It's not like you can't half-ass like do it. You can't be like, well, I feel like I'm not really into it anymore. But I feel like if there's no hope that you're going to just not rekindle your passion and you're going to almost wake up to end up sort of being like, right, what the good thing about being up is that I get to like explore more of this world or explore more of this philosophy or whatever. Then I don't see the point, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, I always say like, man, I'm so jealous. This is gonna sound facetious or something, but like, it is really what I believe. Like, I'm very jealous of my peers who don't have this creative impulse and are
Yeah,
just like satisfied, like climbing a corporate ladder, making more and more money each year, like doing a sure thing, like working a job that their degree prepared them for, and where they know that there's some kind of hierarchy to progress through and there is some kind of line in the future, and then they can just relax on their weekends and go enjoy, you know, time with their friends and spend their hard-earned money and stuff like that. Like that to me sounds like a very nice, simple, fulfilling life. But like the fact of the matter is that I am very compelled to create things, and as I'm sure you are too.
yes, yeah, yeah,
And so that's what I would say is like, don't worry, don't fret. If you're like going to write and it's been like years and you just don't feel that fire for it, then it's don't worry about it. Don't sweat
yeah,
it. Not like it's not some great like I don't want to put it up on some pedestal. I think it's just a personality type. I think that modern society right now is so structured around left brain thinking that it's seen as this miraculous thing because we don't have a society that allows us to like financially support ourselves in any real way until we're
as
mega
creatives,
successful.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so that's why it's kind of seen as this freak accident if you can make it happen. But like, I think it's just a personality type at the end of the day. It might be one of the more rare personality types, but there's still a lot of us out there. And so I think that like, if your creation to you is not a compulsion, then it's totally fine to leave it as a hobby.
well,
You know?
it's kind of a blessing as well because like
Yeah,
like I don't like I said, it's not like creativity isn't this like kind of hobby where you end up just sort of being like, yeah, yeah, I guess I'll do, I mean, it can be obviously, but like, people that have a compulsion to like create something and create something that they're proud of in a personal level and want to show other people, I think can be a bit of a curse. I don't think it's this, I don't think
yeah,
it's
exactly, man. It
it's
takes a
this
lot of
relevant,
time.
yeah,
It takes a lot of sacrifice to
yeah.
make this kind of stuff happen. It's like, man, I could be enjoying a lot more happy hours and probably be, you know, getting paid more money if I didn't care about this kind of
Yeah.
stuff, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah,
I
absolutely.
don't, I don't know. So like, how long have you actually been writing yours?
So I had I had because I was getting into Buddhism when I was 17.
Yeah.
And kind of Taoism and like the Tao and enlightenment and stuff. And I listened to I sort of I ate up a lot of Alan Watts lectures in sort of consciousness and the self and what the world is and death and things like that. A lot of it was to get over death anxiety because because my biggest fear was of death, which I luckily don't really have anymore because I believe that life is just what you make it and that's all that you need to worry about. But I was sort of interested in, at least when I was getting into university, for example, and reading sociology and philosophy, I found that a lot of the ways that they did things kind of rubbed me up the wrong way, sort of treating philosophy as a kind of science, and I felt that there was this big component that was missing from philosophy, which was the discussion of reality outside of concepts and language. And I had this experience when I was 20, 3 years ago now, where I saw the world for how it really was, and I wasn't on drugs or anything, but it was the most I believe that if you had to get if there was one experience that was the most important in my life, it would have been that one. And I was like, I wrote this like crazy journal where none of it makes any sense now, but at the time, I mean, it does. It just, you can't feel it, because as I later sort of realized, it was language itself that was stopping this experience from being brought out to me. And I was like, right, what are concepts and language, and how are they preventing us, and how are they preventing us from obtaining this experience? Because, you know, it kind of occurred to me that like maybe animals aren't on the same wavelength, but they certainly see the world for how it is in a way that we don't, in a certain sort of, you know, they don't conceptualize the world and see the world through representations. They are sort of they see the world nakedly. And that was like this kind of question of mine. I was like, what is it like to see the world nakedly? And then later on in the book process, it was, how can we incorporate such a philosophy of the world and integrate it into our society to actually make the society more fruitful and more sort of free and pragmatic and even anarchic, if you want to go down that road. So so I had the idea when I was 17. I'm 24 in November, and I've written 180 book pages, maybe 190 now, given it's been about a week or so since I've checked. But yeah, I mean, like, yeah, but I've been, as we sort of said, it's been a compulsion for me to write this the whole time. You know, it's been this kind of like, I'm desperate to show people this new perspective, even if the perspective has flaws, you know, and I'm sure it does. But you know, it wasn't, you know, it was, you know, and it wasn't this kind of like, you know, just casual thing, which it can be. And again, like you said, it's not like a problem for writers to just write casually, but like that, you know. But it was the point I'm trying to make is that it was definitely something that I felt that I had to do, and I let it rest when I wanted to, and I let it go when I wanted to, you know. And none of it was ever contrived, and I never tried to write. It was, I just wrote, and then I'd fix it later, and then I'd look at it again and be like, oh, I could improve that sentence a little bit. And I mean, like, I could also say, if I'm not rambling on too much, that like it was March or so last year where I was sort of beginning to like sort of write some serious ideas. And then I'd read them back about 2 weeks later, and I go, you know what, I could improve that a little bit. That's not quite right. And then about a week later, I'd look back and go, oh, I could improve that, and I'll add this. And then about a week later, I'd be like, oh, I could add that, and then maybe not that. And then about a day later, you know, and I did this all the way. I kept doing this very casually, not thinking about the big project as if it was like some monster that I had to overcome. And then by October, I had written some stuff that a friend had told me was some of the best stuff she'd ever read, which is a lovely thing to say. And I'm not sure, you know, I don't think my writing's that good. I think she's being very nice, but that was definitely a milestone for me, where I was like, right, this is writing that I can actually show people and be like, you can understand this, because philosophy is hard to understand, and I'm proud of it. And I'm also trying to get across an idea that can be quite complicated and getting it across simply. And I think that overlaps with a lot of what you're writing complicated things in a simple way. I think, you know, sort of getting complicated ideas across in the simplest notion. I have this idea in the epilogue about knots. You have to, you know, you should get rid of knots. If something doesn't quite flow right in the book, it shouldn't be there. And if you want it to not flow, then that's, you know, then you've written the knot on purpose. It's not there by mistake. You know, so yeah, there's a big thing about all of that. Yeah.
I'm a big advocate of KISS, keep it simple, stupid. You know, like, I think that even with humor, I think that like, I can't stand clever humor. Like when I watch even when I watch things like 30 Rock and Parks and Recs, like I just can't watch it. It's just too clever and like self-aware for me. But like the stuff like, you know, even like Trailer Park Boys and stuff, like it's about these idiot rednecks, right? Who get into all kinds of mischief and stuff. But the writing is actually really funny. And it's that whole idea that like, like you should just, like, the essence of good communication is getting your point across. It's not about getting your point across in a certain way. It's how do I get this person to feel what I'm feeling or see what I'm seeing or understand what I understand? And whatever the most convenient route to that is, the better. But I think usually the simple route is the best. And that's, so many people get tricked by simplicity into thinking that it was easy to do or that it was, but I think that so often the creative process is subtractive. Like you start off just dumping a bunch of words on a page, and then later you end up saying a lot more by saying less, and it's like, I think there's definitely an additive process to art, but I think there's a huge subtractive process too that, people don't necessarily see.
Yeah.
So I like what you said about that. I think it's just the ability to speak to the common person. Like I have enormous, like, even if I wasn't a big fan of, like, I'm not a huge Harry Potter fan, but I like it. It's entertaining to me, and I have enormous respect for what she pulled off with those books.
Yeah,
because
me too.
because of the number of different demographics it can appeal to. Like everyone from children to adults will find something in there that applies to them, and it's like the Beatles of literature. Because it's just like there's a little bit of something for everybody, and like. I know it's fashionable to hate on the Beatles, but I think it's for that very reason, because so many people like them. And why do so many people like them? Because they were able to distill things into, they were able to meet people halfway. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think there's anything cheap about that or whatever. It's like, if the concepts are there, it doesn't matter if you deliver them simply.
Yeah, right. I mean, like, with this sort of thing, I mean, I'm still struggling to find the balance between writing something that's complicated, but like it's something that can resist kind of philosophical criticism, as it, because I've been talking to this philosopher about writing, and he wants me to improve the ideas and make them more coherent and more defined. But at the same time, when you do that, you sort of have to define more and define more, and then you lose track with the common person, which is actually, I believe, the person I want to appeal to more.
Right. So that's what I would challenge you on then is, like, wouldn't you say there's something to a fuck 'em approach, where you just say, hey, you know what, like, fuck the nerds and the pedantic people and the people that want to go over everything with a fine-tooth comb. They're not my audience, and I'm not writing this to please them. That's just my attitude, and I know that might not be everybody's.
No. I'm happy to hear it, and I think it's good for me to hear it, because it gives me a task, it gives me that kind of, because I want this book to be like as good as possible, like, I mean, whatever, not objective score, but like I want it to I want it to have the most. I want it to have the most, the most value. It doesn't have, it doesn't have to be like an objective score. I just
right.
Like this.
You want it to hit the hardest it can hit for your intended audience.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And like, so what I would argue is, I don't know this because I don't read a lot of philosophy for that very reason. Like that, like every time I've tried to dip a toe in philosophy, it's just very wordy and stuff. And so I would venture, am I maybe on the right track by saying,
go for it.
Hypothesizing that maybe the reason why philosophy is so dry is that it's written for an academic audience. And when you're writing for an academic audience, the main concern is not saying anything contradictory or not saying anything that isn't elaborated on enough. So there's so much,
and the fine-tooth comb sort of thing as well.
Yeah, there's so much time spent. There's so much time spent choosing words and trying to make this thing airtight that you end up with 10 times more sentences than you really would need to write if you were just telling a friend about the concept.
Yeah, that's good advice for me anyway. Like, it's a definite thing for me to investigate, and again, the sort of balance kind of comes from my lack of decision over which audience I really want, because like Harry Potter, I want it to be for both. I want to give across ideas that challenge the philosophical landscape or whatever, not like to a massive degree, only just in the bit that I can, but I also want to just provide something for anyone, so anyone can pick up the book and then get something from it. And I think I've achieved that to an extent. For example, the chapter I sent you was the most complicated chapter by far. So that alone kind of gives that kind of gives the idea that I'm not too far off, but it is definitely this problem of just trying to work out what kind of book I really want.
Well, and I mean, I can imagine that, like, you see me on, we're both apart. We met on a music forum online.
Yeah, right.
And one of my favorite things to do in that music forum is to kind of troll people because, well, because music is like music forums I've found through being in a couple of them, like there's all these very serious young men in their like early 20s who think that because they've listened to some really complex music and really hard to find music, that all of a sudden they understand music and they just understand more.
Yeah.
The whole universe is within the scope of their understanding.
They're called
And
patricians, aren't they? Is that
yeah,
am I
yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. They call them patricians. But even the people who make patrician jokes are usually patricians themselves. Like it's just such a disease on these forums. All these guys, and like the women are all rolling their eyes at it too, because I've just found it tends to be along gender lines. I'm not trying to like pander here, but you often see these young women come in and say they enjoy stuff, and they either get torn apart or they get like mansplained to. And even guys like me who are like, I'll say something about, whatever, the Beatles, or even like, I don't know, I'll say something about Led Zeppelin or something like that. And you just get called all kinds of names, and I just laugh it off because it's like, dude, I've written literally hundreds of songs for 11 years, and I've studied music inside and out, and I still don't consider myself a music expert, you know?
Yeah,
But
sure.
like I know enough now to know that these albums are classic and timeless for a reason. Like there's some amazing songcraft on display and stuff, and it doesn't require this complex package. Anyway, long story short, that's just like that's just 22-year-old dudes on the internet being annoying. But like I can only imagine what a philosophy, like you've probably chosen one of the more intimidating audiences to write for.
Well, this is something I want to say. Like, I don't think I chose to write the book. That's another thing that, like, I don't. This is another thing about creativity. I don't think that you choose to write. I don't think it's necessarily this kind of like, I'm going to write a book about language today, or I'm going to write a fantasy book today. It's a
Right.
much more inconspicuous process where it sort of chooses you. I think that's a better way of thinking about it. It kind of chooses you to be the vessel that it comes out. Not to sound too esoteric, but I think it's definitely more of a process where you are sort of you get the idea and you see where the idea goes, and then you just have this kind of itch to write it, and
Yeah.
then you have an itch to fix, and then you sort of, it's kind of, I write in the epilogue that there's a kind of a process where when you write a book, it feels like you're slowly waking up, where you're sort of unconscious when you're beginning to write the book, and then towards the end you sort of realize what it is that you're writing, and then the writing has kind of taken on its own life and power, and you end up just being like, oh right. And I don't think at any point you've decided to do that.
Totally.
It's a much more inconspicuous process where
Yeah.
it writes you almost. I think there's
Yeah.
something like that at least.
Definitely. Yeah, without going into too much of an aside, I definitely experienced that with my book. Like, so I'm writing Act 2 now. Act 1 took me, years to gather all the notes and kind of like get to a place where I was ready for it. But I took my leisurely time. I was doing music and stuff. But the point is, like, Act 2, I outlined it, which is like the hard part. That's when you decide what all the main points you need to hit in the story are, plot points. And I finished my outline in like 1 week, and today is actually the first day that I'm going to start writing on Act 2. But that's what I'm saying is, like, once I had this world established, it just started writing itself.
Yeah.
It just started like making its own characters. Like it just makes sense in this kind of world that there would be this kind of character and this kind of character and this kind of location and these kind of events. And so, yeah, I can totally relate. Like, you just hit that point where the book starts writing itself.
Yeah, man. Yeah. I mean, we're on 1 hour and 10 minutes now, so
Yeah, let's wrap it up. Oh, well,
yeah.
I think for you, man, I mean, I don't see myself as some kind of wise sage or anything, but like for you, I really do believe in this. Like, especially as we've been talking, like it's really solidified it for me. Like, I think you just need to, what you were just saying, like let the book write itself, write the kind of book that you really want to write, and don't even give a second thought to the audience. Like, the audience will find you if you're pursuing your passion. Like, I have no idea what my final audience is going to be, like what my lead demographic is going to be for my books. I just am trying to just stay 100% focused on the kind of work that I'm passionate about, because I know that there are other people out there who are going to share my same passions. And I feel like the same with you. Like if you, especially with the philosophy audience, like I would be absolutely paralyzed by fear if I was thinking about philosophy professors reading my book, you know? Like you can't think about that. I think, right? You just got to just do it and forget everything you know about that, because we're living in an era, especially now, where there's no gatekeepers. You don't have to meet X requirements to
No.
get it into certain publishing houses. You know, like we see all these like teenagers building these million strong YouTube followings, just doing stupid dances, you know, and TikTok and stuff. Like there's no rules anymore. Like if your audience is out there, you can find them, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. I mean, there's one last thing I'd like to sort of say from my experience. It's a very good thing to sort of document your process and even maybe document it like even publicly, you know. And I'm not saying like be completely transparent in your entire life, but
Right.
but like as I'm doing now, I mean, I think it's kind of meta, but like I think it's a good idea to sort of like to document what's sort of going on in your life, as opposed to like
Yeah. I'm gonna
keeping
write
it
that
behind
down actually.
keeping it behind like closed doors and being like the sort of mysterious writer that everyone's going to find and appreciate. I don't think that's actually a very successful route. I think documenting the process and as I'm doing, you know, like I mean, even like I'm growing loads of vegetables in the garden and I'm putting it on vlogs and I'm doing all of this sort of stuff, and I'm building my businesses, you know, very slowly, and especially
Right.
very slowly because I can't meet anyone, and a lot of people I want to work with are busy doing other things, or they, you know, or they're finishing their degrees or whatever like that, and I can't do events because, like, you know, obviously not, because of lockdown. Um, but like, but there's definitely what I can do. I can definitely document the sort of the process leading up to it, and it's going to build a ton of hype for what you're actually going to make in the end. And I think that's a much more successful route than being the mysterious guy that everyone's going to discover one day and fall in love with. Because I don't, this is another problem with creativity. It's not, it's very rare that like you're going to be able to like monetize it or at least make it successful in the way that you want it to be.
Yeah.
So fucking work hard,
Yeah, you're
like
right.
don't force,
You're
but
right. I
work.
think you got to do that, man. I got to learn to do that more. I think just document the process. It gives people more potential entry points, you know, because I was
Yeah,
lamenting the fact that like my chosen art form takes so long to gestate compared to others, you know.
yeah,
Whereas like somebody can go on and do a dance or make a funny video in like a few hours, whereas I get to show people my work only every, you know, once every half a year or whatever when I turn out a book. But yeah, like you said, if you just document the process, then you have a lot more entry points to like kind of show people what you're up to and get people following the journey.
keep engagement, and it's also nice to look back on it in a few years. Like I used to make loads of Dadaist kind of surreal comedy videos on YouTube, and that's under neutral pasta. Like I can put it in the comments actually. Like we'll see we'll see what people's
Yeah.
reception are, but because it's very odd stuff. But yeah, like it's just nice to look back on that and be like, oh my god, my hair used to be like that. It's even like those little things. It's just nice to be like, this is what I've done, and I can be proud of all of this stuff that I've accomplished. And I wasn't just sitting
Yeah.
there smoking weed every day. I was also busy doing
Right.
these other things, and I think it gives you energy to actually like continue doing it. I find that the more I do, the more energy I have to do things. That if I sort of lament, then I find myself much more kind of like, like forgetting the process and forgetting how to do things.
Yeah.
And of course, and another thing, all these thoughts coming into my head at once. Like you can. It's very good to have multiple hobbies or like multiple interests and switching between them. I think that's a very important.
Absolutely.
I think it's a
Absolutely.
very important thing because you're gonna wake. If you're gonna do the same thing every day, it's gonna kill you. So like even if you're just learning how to juggle, like you say like, okay, today I'm gonna learn how to juggle as opposed to write a book, and you're still being productive, and you're letting the mind incubate and you're letting the mind rest in other ways. So it's going to keep your energy up to do that. I think
Yeah.
to 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 have multiple things going on because I wrote a song. I couldn't write anything for the book, so I decided to write a song. And you know,
Totally. Yeah, you're not too miserable then when you run into a bump with something. You just go take a break, work on
yeah,
something for a while, and then
yeah,
when you're ready again, you come back to it. Yeah, 100% agree.
cool, man. Well, it's been a real pleasure chatting to you, Seb. It's been really
Yeah.
nice, and I've definitely taken on some advice on how I should how I should write, and maybe you have as well. So
Yeah,
it's
man.
been lovely. It's
I
been lovely,
took some
man. Thanks
notes.
for
Yeah.
yeah. You have seen notes. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I have one big note, and it's like keep it
Nice.
simple, stupid. So yeah. Okay, so we're gonna honorably mention our patrons who are keeping the channel going, which is wonderful of them to do. And you can do this if you go on Patreon for £1 a month. You can get your name and a tagline of your choice. So this is what I'm gonna do now. We thank Oliver, who says, "Yeah, I'll drink to that." We thank Rachel, who says, "Communism is for life, not just for Christmas." We thank Manny, who says, "Long live Wombstone," which is he's my vocalist for my band. We thank Karoz, who says, "Nothing yet. I still haven't determined who she is. She's the only patron that I don't know the identity of." We thank
Nice.
Maisie, who says 9/11 was an inside job. Still a topic for still a future podcast discussion. We thank Ryan, who says, "Keep true, be fair, and spread love." And we thank Snow, who says, "Be excellent to each other." And I think that wraps things up. Thanks for coming on, Seb. And
Thanks, James.
and
Thanks
we'll
for
see you
having me.
guys in the next episode. Awesome, awesome.
All right.
See you later,
And if you
guys.
want, oh, you're
Oh,
gonna put my link in the thing, right?
I'll
I
put
saw
your
you
and
Okay.
I'll put Sebastian's novel what he's got so far online in the description.
Yeah,
And
that's Act 1 of 4. It's very entertaining. I think you'll really enjoy it, especially if you like fantasy, mystery, western, or horror. It's got a little bit of all of those in it.
I can say I was reading it out of like, okay, I'll give it a read, not expecting too much, and it was like I was kind of like, wow, this is really like fucking something. So yeah, for
Thanks,
sure.
man.
No, all right, okay. Have a good night, everyone, or good morning, or even good afternoon, and long live. See you later.